I'm going to cover a bunch of stuff related to specifically images and type on the web. I'm going to also talk a lot about culture and changing the culture to care about performance of your company. But I want to highlight that this is just like a piece of the amazing track that Velocity's put together. Jasenia Perez-Cruz is speaking right after this, actually after lunch, about a very similar topic. She and I have actually dovetailed our talks to complement each other really well. So she'll be basically compounding on the stuff that I'm talking about today. So definitely check out hers. And for the operations people who are thinking about the usability and designing their alerting tools, please make sure you go to Allison McKnight's talk later. Also later today. What time is that? 3:40. In which room? Not this room. So go and check out that talk as well. So everything today is going to dovetail really nicely together. Cool. So I wrote this book. Check out that bird. It's called Designing for Performance. I changed the talk title to not be Designing for Performance, but admittedly this is my Designing for Performance talk because Steve Satters is giving the Design Plus Performance talk later, and Jasenia is giving Design Decisions through the Lens of Performance. So I try to be different. So I also work for Etsy. I'm a senior engineering manager there, and one of the teams that I work with is the performance team. Raise your hand if you're on the performance team at Etsy. There you are. Thanks, guys, for coming. That's going in your reviews later. So this performance team effectively helps all of the other engineers at Etsy build their stuff well, right? So everybody's contributing to the website. Everybody's pushing new features, pushing new products. Product managers are contributing code. Designers are contributing code. And we want to make sure that whenever they're pushing stuff out to the site, they're doing it as performant as humanly possible. So we educate and empower people at our company and also make tweaks ourselves. As you're going to hear a lot about today, performance is absolutely part of the user experience, right? It's being factored into search engine results. Jasenia is going to go into a lot of the studies that prove that this is true. And I want to focus a little bit on how we at Etsy measure this. Oops. So one time we ran an experiment and we added 160 kilobytes of hidden images to a page on mobile web. This means that the only part of the user experience that changed was how long the page took to load. Nothing else changed, right? And it triggered a 12% increase in bounce rate. Terrifying on mobile. Jank is when you scroll on a page, right, and it like hitches, it stutters a little bit. So one time we had scrolling jank on one of our pages, the activity feed. It was due to some overlapping border shadows. And once we eliminated this, we ran an experiment that showed with the jank and without the jank. And we found that people favorited way more items way more often. So this is all to say that performance is absolutely part of the user experience, just like aesthetics is. I'm going to focus not just on how to make stuff as fast as possible, but how to find a balance between aesthetics and speed. Because really, we're not just talking about speed, right? We're talking about the whole user experience. And our industry historically has not designed for performance. We've got increasingly rich content, lots of dynamic images, larger JavaScript files, complex animations, etc. We may have designed our layout for mobile with stuff like responsive web design, but we don't necessarily think about speed on mobile devices. And some, especially responsively designed sites, are irresponsible with the amount of stuff that they load. So why am I focusing specifically on mobile? I'm going to talk about everything really in terms of mobile connections today. So before a device can transmit or receive data, it has to establish a radio channel with the network. And I want to like visualize this in a little hand wavy way. So here's my little diagram. This process of connecting to the cell tower and then connecting to the web host and then returning the data can take several seconds. The best part is, if there's no data transmitted or received after a timeout, that channel is going to go idle, which requires a new channel to be established. And this can obviously wreak havoc on your web page load times. So on a typical US desktop using Wi-Fi, that request's average round trip takes roughly 50 milliseconds, but on a mobile network, that can be upwards of 300 milliseconds. Who here remembers what dial-up felt like? Don't leave me hanging. Thank you. That's what this feels like, right? So this process has to repeat over and over again in order to get all of that data back to your browser. And most of the time, the browser is also acknowledging that it received each chunk. So you can see how this kind of compounds on mobile web and with mobile apps. So how can we start to think about optimizing all of our stuff, right? Images, fonts, but everything else too for mobile networks? everybody in here probably knows about web page test. I'm going to use some examples here. For those of you who aren't familiar, you want to enter your site's URL into this bar here, and then you can choose from a drop-down of modified connection speeds, locations around the world, et cetera, and you can have a test run that tells you all this stuff about your site. So the first thing I want to focus on is perceived performance. The perception of how fast your site loads is more important than how long it takes to actually load. Right? Users' perception of speed will be based on how quickly they start to see content render on the page, or how quickly it becomes interactive, or how smoothly the site scrolls, right? So speed index here, which is something that web page test gives us, as well as the videos of how fast sites load, will help us understand our site's perceived performance. The second thing we're optimizing for is the number of requests that it takes to load our page. This is just a handful of the assets needed to load Etsy.com's homepage. This is like, images, CSS files, JavaScript files, etc. The number of requests, this waterfall goes down on for way, way, way longer, each row represents a different asset that's taken to load the homepage. The more that happens here, the longer your site's going to take to load. So you want to shorten this up. And the third thing we want to talk about is the size of those requests. So we don't just want to decrease the number of requests, but here, again, just a handful from Etsy's homepage. They range from 8.7 kilobytes for a CSS file to upwards of 74K for a JPEG. So we want to optimize for the total file size of these requests as well. So hold on to your butts. We're going to talk about images most. It's going to take up the bulk of the presentation. We're going to talk about fonts. We're going to talk about patterns for those two things with your markup. And then we're going to talk a little bit about culture. So images. Who has seen this graph before? All right, I'm surprising some of you with it then. So this is from the HTTP archive, which is really handy if you want to have some data to impress your bosses. So what they do is they index the Alexa top 1 million sites, I believe. And then in this case, they represented in a little pie chart the average bytes that make up page weight. And here you can see that images make up the vast bulk of this pie chart. And I like to call this part of the presentation images the nerdy parts, because I'm going to go into some history as to why we have so many different image formats and how they work, so you can learn how to optimize each of them. So we'll start with the one that we all know about, right? JPEGs. It stands for Joint Photographic Experts Group. The group first began in 86, and they released their first standard in 92. We all know this, right? JPEGs are best for photos or images with many colors. They're really good at this stuff. And this is because JPEGs are lossy, and their algorithm is based on how humans see and perceive information. This means that humans, our eyes and our brains, are really good at processing stuff over smooth gradients in areas of low contrast. Our eyes take a lot more work, and our brains take a lot more work to process high contrast areas, especially things like edges. So when it comes to JPEGs, your optimization options are to reduce noise, another complexity in the image, decrease the export quality. We've all played with this slider in Photoshop, but somewhere between like 50, 60, 75 usually is a sweet spot. And then interesting, you want to blur unimportant areas. This is to create more of those smoother gradients, right? This is to decrease noise and decrease other areas of complexity. So let's first talk about that quality slider. So the image on the left, I know that projectors can sometimes be really hard. Believe it or not, the image on the left has a bunch of artifacting around the high contrast edges. This means that there's like pixels. You can tell that it's a little bit rough around the edges. On the right, with quality all the way up to 100, it's a lot smoother. The quality 100 is a much significantly larger file size than the quality 25, but it does look better. There was recently released an article by Justin Avery. I have the link at larahogan.me/design along with these slides. And he took this picture of the father of responsive web design, Ethan Marcotte, and he blurred all of the backgrounds, right? And what this did was it took all of the unimportant aspects of the image and it made them smoother. This is a JPEG. Before the blur, the image weighed about 211 kilobytes, and after the blur, it weighed just 150. Pretty impressive. I took it one step further. And I cropped it because I wanted to see what was the difference based on the complexity in the image. The left crop is only 50 kilobytes. The center crop was 57. You can see like it has the chandelier and some more information. And on the right, the 60 kilobyte image has a ton more data, a ton more edges, right? So unfortunately, the left crop, although it is smaller, it's like the worst looking image. So we don't want to go with that one. We want to find that balance of speed and aesthetics. So next, I want to talk about GIFs. So CompuServe first introduced the GIF format in 87 to provide a color image format for their file downloading areas. So, right, 87, the animation versions came out in 89. So GIFs are really only best for animations that can't be replaced with CSS. I'm going to ask you repeatedly in this presentation to please don't use them, right? If you want to know about them, they've got like these 256 colors per frame, meaning for each animation frame, you can have up to 256 different colors. They are lossless, unlike JPEGs, but again, please don't use them. If you absolutely must use them, you can change their dithering. This is like your optimization lever. So dithering examines adjacent pixels and chooses a new color somewhere in between them to give that appearance of a smoother blend. So again, projectors are hard, but you can kind of tell. With dithering set to 0, you've got a lot of banding in this rainbow. And with a dithering set to 100, it's a lot smoother. But you can also see the difference in file size, right? A more complex image with much more data in it is going to be much larger. But check out what happens when I rotate that image. What? So on the left, we have that GIF, right? It's like 9.7 kilobytes. On the right, when I rotate it, it goes up to 21 kilobytes. That's terrible, and it's so bananas. And why does it do that? So GIFs are really good about horizontal redundancy, right? So the more detail or noise elsewhere in the image, the larger the file is going to be. So I'm not kidding. Replace GIFs, right, with CSS where you can. Any non-animated GIFs, you should be replacing with PNG8s, and I'll show you why in a second. And you can always have, if you have like movie GIFs, right, you can replace them with asynchronously loading videos. You should be testing this. See what works best on your site for your use case. See what loads fastest for your users. And if you ever wonder what's going to be faster, just throw it into web page test and find out. I want to bring up the point about videos. So some sites like GiphyCat will optimize GIFs for you and show them to you in a smaller HTML5 video format to save you on bandwidth. So thankfully, sites around the globe, right, are doing this all over the place. But let's get back to those PNG8s. So PNG8s came out because GIFs compression algorithm was patented by Unisys, right? That patent expired in like 2003 or 2004. But then PNG8s came out. And check out that difference in file size. Same rotated image, but PNG8s handle it a lot better. GIFs were 21 kilobytes in this case, and a PNG8 is only 1.62 kilobytes. Bananas. So portable network graphics were released as a non-patented replacement for GIFs. People were sick of that patent, understandably. So just like GIFs, right, they're best for images with few colors. They are lossless like GIFs. They've got that 256 color palette like GIFs. They have dithering like GIFs, but they recognize horizontal and vertical patterns. Now you may have heard of also PNG24s, and they're totally different, but they share the same name for some reason. But PNG24s have no restriction on that color palette, and they handle transparency very differently than PNG8s. So people grew sick of that 256 color palette when computers that could display more than 256 colors became more popular. And there actually are a ton of seats up here on this side. Feel free to walk past the front. So for your optimization options here, you can decrease noise and you can decrease the number of colors of PNG24s. Let's take a look at different PNGs here. So PNG8s, we're looking at a drop shadow, right? We want that drop shadow to blend in with the background nicely. So with the PNG8 file, you give Photoshop a background color to blend it, and they have no partial transparency, right? It's like fully transparent pixels beyond that drop shadow, and then it does the blending for you with that matte background. But let's take a look at the PNG24. So we see partial transparency here. Interesting note, I've been called out on Twitter a couple of times because I keep on referring to these as PNG24s, which admittedly is what Photoshop calls them. I think it's a little more handy to call it this way. But they're actually PNG32s. So they've got these 24 bits of color and 8 bits of alpha transparency. Names are hard. So obviously this results in a lot larger files, right? So PNG24s in this case, for a very complex image with lots of colors, is like 1.28 megs. The JPEG at 75 quality is only 288. And this is why we want to use JPEGs for photos. You shouldn't really be using PNG24s for anything other than when you absolutely need that complex transparency. Who here has actually implemented something with WebP? Okay, a few people, thank you. We are hoping to experiment with this at Etsy sometime in the next year or so. So WebP is pretty cool. It was developed by Google to reduce file sizes on the web, and it has both lossless and lossy compression, and it supports transparency animation. Sounds pretty good. So WebP employs a methodology from the video codec to compress keyframes in videos. It effectively predicts a value from neighboring blocks of pixels, and then it encodes only the difference between its prediction and the actual value. Pretty handy. So to make these, there's a Photoshop plugin, and there's a couple of online conversion tools that you can use to create these. But unfortunately, right now it's limited support, so you want to be using something fancy to service only to the users that can actually benefit from it. All right, so we want to save even more bytes and requests now that we've created these images. So the first thing you want to do is replace any simple images you have with SVG. Scale up vector graphics, right? So Macromedia and Microsoft introduced VML as a proposal, whereas Adobe Systems and Sun Microsystems submitted a competing format known as PGML, and the W3C was like, thank you, everybody, but let's be cool. Let's have this XML-based vector format called SVG in 2001. SVG is really rad. It scales up beautifully for Retina. If you inline it, it'll eliminate an HTTP request. It is not supported on less than or equal to IE8. Who is still supporting IE8? No judgment here. We still do. Okay, yeah, I understand. I've got some stuff for you in here that'll help with that a little bit. But notably, SVG, when you create it, especially with something like Illustrator, exports with a lot of cruft. So I want to address that for a second. Look at how terrible this is. This is a star. That's it. And look, it's so big. That code is terrible. So just like kill all that. It's just junk that Illustrator exports. And then you're left with just this. It's pretty rad. You can save this as a file and apply it as a background element. In this case, we've got a class of star, and it'll, again, scale up beautifully. You can do a ton of stuff to it. Or you could inline it right into your HTML. So there's my SVG tag and my polygon tag and close SVG tag. It's beautiful. The one thing I want to comment on here, though, is that if you inline it, it removes the cacheability of the image, and it can potentially blow your HTML file size. So just like with everything else, you should test it. Run it through web page test and see what actually happens. Another tip for reducing image file size, sprites. So in this case, we're talking about requests here, not necessarily file size, right? So we've got all of these different images lumped into one image file, and this helps us serve up just one piece of it at a time. We can cache this. It's pretty rad. These are a lot of old sprites that we have. We unfortunately have a lot more sprites than this now on Etsy, but we're hoping to clean them up soon. So I ran a test in this company I worked at before, Dyn, and we had these 10 thumbnail slots, and we had 26 images that rotated in and out of these thumbnail slots. And I wondered, what if I just sprited them? I mean, that'd be huge, right? It would add a bunch more markup, CSS, JavaScript. The image file would technically be bigger, but because I would save all those image requests, would that be more efficient? It turns out it's good that I ran the test because it did add 60 kilobytes to the total page weight, but it cut page load time by 35% because it eliminated all those requests. So that's it with everything else. You should test it. You should also only be serving the right amount of bytes to your users. No more serving up tons of stuff and then making the user just deal with the overhead. So your best bet for displaying a correctly sized picture in modern browsers is to take advantage of the responsive images spec. So this new spec provides lots of different ways to tell the browser which image files to download and when, and you can include a fallback for older browsers that don't support this, meaning that you can use this today. I'm going to talk about just a sliver of the responsive images spec, but there's a ton of resources out there for people interested in learning more. So this simple example uses the source set attribute, and that helps the browser determine which file to download. So the browser is going to use the sizes information to understand the size of the image that's going to end up in the page based on the viewport of your user. And then it's going to choose whichever it thinks is the best image source. So we start with sizes here. So it looks at the matching media query, and then it tells us what percentage of the viewport width this image will make up. So in this case of max width of 480 pixels, the image will make up 75% of the viewport width. It makes the browser effectively do some math. Then it'll look at the source set list. So source set plus sizes gives the browser choice, and the browser is in a much better position to pick the best image for that user based on things like the device's pixel density or whether or not the user has opted into Google's fast browser setting. So this takes the control out of our hands, right, which we all like to control, but frankly, this is going to be a better option for your users. And one additional superpower of the responsive images spec is that type attribute. So we can tell our user's browser to ignore an image source unless it recognizes the contents of that type attribute. So in this example, browsers that recognize SVG are going to download the SVG file, and the rest of us will download the fallback PNG. So again, we're able to save our user from downloading those unnecessary bytes of extra overhead. All right, lossless compression. Image Optim, Smush It, there's a ton of tools out there. They're super smart. They are perceptually lossless in what they end up outputting for you. Just run everything you possibly can, every image you possibly can through this stuff. We recently ran all of the PNGs in Etsy's template through lossless compression. On average, we saved just under 20% of the file savings per file, and overall in that directory, saved over 44% of the file size. So absolutely go through and do this with all of your images. But don't do it by hand. You should be automating it, right? There are CLIs, there's WordPress plugins, there's SVG scrubbers. You should be looking at all these options for your automated tools and workflow. Again, all these tools are linked to from larahogan.me/design. And one cool superpower of all this is you're going to save the energy that it takes for your pages to load on users' devices. There was a study that was done, presented at Velocity some years ago, that showed that if all of the images on Amazon's site, if they had taken them and just reproduced them as JPEGs at really high quality, it would have saved 20% of the energy needed to load Amazon on small devices. And on Facebook, it would have saved upwards of 30%. So you're not just saving page load time here, you're impacting the overall user experience. Congrats. You just made it through the bulk of the performance work, right? So now the images are done. You can take a deep breath. We could talk about fonts. Fonts are the bane of my existence. Everybody who works with me knows I get mad about this all the time. And I work with a lot of great designers, and great designers are making a lot of changes on the site using fonts in really smart ways. So I'm very thankful to work with them, but I'm going to tell you why I'm so mad about it. So the first thing is that IE 6 through 8 downloads all font face files, right? Even if they're not used on the page. If you declare them in the top of your file, older versions of IE and newer versions with compatibility mode turned on are going to download those files. The worst. So you should only be importing the font weights that you absolutely need. And this has everything to do with optimizing the size and the number of those requests. The more font weights you use, the longer the page will take to load, because font files can be very heavy. So the average font served by Google Web Fonts is about 35K, but can be upwards of 200K depending upon language and character support. So one consideration that we make at Etsy is to only load font files on larger screen sizes. We do this using a media query. So we would rather save our users from downloading the extra font file if they're on a mobile device. So this will download and apply the font file only if the user's device matches the media query. The other thing that you can do is make optimizations to your font files using tools like Squirrel's font face generator. So you can remove unnecessary characters, which is also called character subsetting. So let's take a look at this. Squirrel gives you a ton of options for subsetting your fonts. And at the very bottom of this, you can actually type in individual single characters. Looks like there's a little heart I added, and then a little heart. You can see it popping up down at the bottom. You can see that, so I'm adding only the characters that I know I'm going to need. This will drastically reduce the font size. The trick here is that you should be documenting your subsetting so that others, if they need to edit it later, know how to do it correctly. And this, my friends, is my war story of how I poorly documented some font subsetting and caused maybe the most ridiculous bug on Etsy's site ever. So we got this email called Horse-Related Issues from Vernon. And Vernon said, "Hey everyone, we've been asking around, but it looks like there are some horse-related issues affecting reviews on some pages." And we were all like, horse-related issues? Quit horsing around, Vernon. But sure enough, in Etsy forums, users started mentioning a strange occurrence. A horse would show up in their rating. So as you can see from this user-submitted screenshot, a horse head was overlaid on top of a gray star. This user had 4 and a horse stars. So it turns out we'd accidentally dropped the half-star glyph from our icon font because I hadn't adequately documented the process for updating the character's subsetting to add those new icons. That meant that instead of the half-star, iOS was finding what it thought was going to be the next closest thing, and it shows like the goofiest horse head imaginable. It started a really epic thread at work full of horse puns. We all thought this was hilarious, and we are a very pun-focused organization. Oh, man. So heed this warning, right? Document your character subsetting, especially if you use icon fonts. Or you might lose an entire day to contributing to a company-wide email about horse puns. Whew. All right, let's get back to the boring stuff here. Let's talk about creating patterns. All right, so we want to save development time and page load time, right, with all this work that we're doing. I once did a cleanup effort on a site, and I found that by going through it, making things more semantic, more repurposable, creating more patterns, I was able to save a ton of page load time. It absolutely helped with our development workflows, but look at this. HTML, CSS, and style sheet images all dropped in file size. So as you're designing and you're developing, ask yourself, can someone else reuse this pattern? Because assets that get reused can get cached, which is obviously a huge performance win. And then you should be naming elements by function or content, right, not by design. This is hotly debated, but this is my recommendation for small or medium-sized sites. It can be hugely beneficial. It's your canary in a coal mine, just like inefficient selectors. So why would I have a class of ID of sidebar and a link called search, rather than just a link, a sidebar in search, or just search? This is a good indicator that you've got some really messed up stuff happening. You're trying to increase specificity to make things a lot easier, I guess, in your code. This is the worst. This is usually an indicator of divitis, right? We've got lots and lots of divs, increasing specificity, allowing you to apply these styles. My favorite representation of divitis usually happens using Firefox's 3D view. This is also what I use to prove to myself that cleanup is actually work. So this shows your nested depth of elements on a page. That was before cleanup and after cleanup. After creating some patterns, you can see that the nested depth is a lot shorter in my after. This is a great visual representation of code sprawl. This is every single color that Etsy has defined in its CSS code base, side by the number of times it appears in our code base. So that rainbow at the top are all colors that only appear once. Meanwhile, those black and gray bars at the bottom extend like a few thousand pixels off screen. And we had something similar happening with our fonts. We were using all these different font weights and styles across Etsy.com and our apps. This caused major performance issues, right? The font sizes added up, and it took multiple requests to load them, and sometimes upwards of 8 font files per page. So the other problem here was that we used the different types of fonts differently on our apps and on our website, which was a total mess for branding and for product alignment. There was no visual consistency or clear hierarchy, and it was really hard to figure out how to design something new using our fonts. It was important to create less cognitive overhead as we design these patterns. So 2 designers at Etsy realized that we used way too many fonts, and they counted the usage across the site. And they came up with one clear outlier for our headlines. And these 2 women decided to come up with a font pattern proposal. They drafted this proposal, and they started doing research on what would change in the desktop and the apps, and got feedback from other designers about the legibility and the flexibility of this proposal. Then they went and they tested their changes across pages and posted a link to their development machines so people could poke around and easily see and experience the difference. They started here with the listing page on Etsy because it's our most popular and our most important page, and it was using way too many weights. So it felt important to test the impact of the changes first there. So they came up with a proposed new scale for consistency across all of our platforms for even better clarity as people are designing and developing. And then to verify that fewer fonts are actually better for our users, they ran an experiment with just Guardian Medium as the headline copy. Then they worked one-on-one with an Android engineer and an iOS engineer to remove the extra weights from the apps too, and have been teaming up with the rest of the design team to implement the new font patterns across the site. This saved roughly 270 kilobytes of page weight in 5 requests on average. It's amazing, and it's better not just for page weight, right, but also for our cognitive overhead as we're designing and developing. And remember that code sprawl? We're going to do the same thing with colors too, and I'm really excited about it. We should be making it as easy as possible for I just mentioned designers, right? Non-developers to do performance. Automate everything we've talked about. Automate that compression. Utilize style guides. Automate performance testing. Automate image resizing. We have this thing called the Seller Handbook at Etsy, and we have these content editors that are not developers and not designers contributing to this. They have lots of beautiful images that they want to write about, and it goes up live. So we want the site to stay fast, so do these content editors, and we want to help them do their jobs easily, but still help the site be awesome. So how can we do this? Well, another development team was working on their CMS for the Seller Handbook, and they decided that source set might work. So they would, in this case, deliver the appropriately sized images to our users. So how can we do this in a way where the seller handbook team didn't even have to think about it? The CMS team developed the CMS in such a way that when a content editor uploads an image, it gets automatically processed into the specified list of image sizes that we're going to need on the site. And as part of that uploading process, it dynamically creates the markup needed. So this content editor never even has to think about performance. This is automatically built into their workflow. They measured these changes about the seller handbook over Office Wi-Fi. Imagine the savings over cell networks, right? On small screens, it was up to 14x improvement in the speed because we're delivering just the right amount of bytes to our users. And if at this point you're like wondering, like, how do I actually like make change here? How can I start to make a difference? And I'm a little bit nervous about this. I would recommend A/B testing. We do this a lot at Etsy. We will test every change, including performance changes, and we can continue to benchmark and iterate on performance and aesthetic decisions over time as you make any changes to your site. This is just a screenshot from an example experiment that we run, but I'll run this for performance tests too. I want to measure and see, are we really making a difference on engagement metrics whenever we clean up a part of the site? So at this point, you may be thinking to yourself, I deeply care about performance, but other people at my company don't. Maybe designers don't, maybe engineers, maybe management. So who's responsible for implementing these techniques I've been talking about? Being a performance cop or a performance janitor just is not sustainable. Performance is truly everybody's responsibility. Otherwise, you will be endlessly fighting an uphill battle. You need a culture of performance. But this is probably the most difficult thing when it comes to optimizing your site for performance. We at Etsy even still struggle with it, and we've had top-down management buy-in and a metrics-focused development cycle for years. I want to highlight again that perceived performance is the most important. You can use these web page test videos to make a huge impact. Compare before and after performance improvements. Compare your desktop experience to your mobile experience. Compare your domestic experience to your international experience. Compare you and your competitor. I recently wrote an article for A List Apart on how to do this and implement this at your company. It's also on the resources page. I reached out to a bunch of people on the web and said, hey, have you tried this? It works for me. Does it work for you? And sure enough, I got a ton of tweets about how other people have used this to convince management, to convince clients, to convince other people around their organization that they should care about performance. The other thing that we've done a lot at Etsy is being very public about our performance numbers. This is Seth Walker. He was the performance engineering manager before I became it, and he published our first ever performance report. And being public about our numbers forced us to iterate and improve on our most important pages, right? This is the thing. We can talk about it all the time, but if you're scared of this, remember, page hold times are not a secret. A few folks at some monitoring companies who shall not be named, they may be in the room, reached out to us and said, like, yep, those numbers that you published, that's what we were seeing for you too. Remember that, like, monitoring companies may be looking at you, but like your competitors are absolutely also looking at you already. This stuff is not a secret. You can be as public as you want about it. And the cool thing about publishing this is that it motivated our development teams to get better. We immediately started seeing buy-in from development teams around the company. So in the first report, we had this one clear outlier, the homepage, right? It stuck out as our slowest page by far. But in the follow-up performance report, just a few months later, we highlighted the awesome improvement that that team had committed, right? Those developers not only fixed it, they made it one of the fastest pages on the site. And the side effect of all of this uncovering performance bugs that we wouldn't have otherwise seen is that we get to actively celebrate these kinds of wins internally. This is our dashboard that goes up on a wall monitor, and we force the poor performance hero there in the center to hold up a cross stitch of like heart, heart, heart performance, and we all celebrate with them and put a ton of graphs around it because we want to be the carrot, right? We don't want to be the stick when it comes to performance. I'm not kidding. Here's the bunting that Allison made that goes up right over we want this to be a really cool thing because these are people not on the performance team committing and doing really cool stuff with performance. And remember how I was talking about those videos? I wasn't lying. We put them up. We want people to feel the difference between the listing page and a cable connection, right, and versus over a simulated 3G connection. We want people to feel the effects of being on mobile. And I like to call this slide, Poor Australia. But these people are developing mostly in the United States, sometimes elsewhere, but they have like really shiny hardware and really fast office connections, and we typically don't feel how our users are actually experiencing the site around the globe or on mobile connections. we need to have empathy, right? Not just with our users, but with our fellow designers, our developers, our upper management. We need to help them care for our users and their experience too. As Brad Frost says, good performance is absolutely good design. And there's a ton of other improvements you can make to the back end, right? But most of the end user response time happens on the front end. So optimize for good performance and you'll have a huge leg up on creating an excellent user experience. All of this stuff is in my book, which is available for free on designingforperformance.com. O'Reilly was kind enough to let me publish it using HTML versions. The book is also available in print and an ebook for purchase. All proceeds, when you purchase it, go to charities helping women and girls learn how to code. So please go and buy 12 for your company. That's it. Thank you so much. I won't make you look at that too much longer. I just love them. It's so cute. Definitely time for questions. I was going to be memorized by that. Hi, right there in the back, yeah.
When you're talking about the lossless compression, is that mostly removing the metadata overhead?
So the question was, what happens when I say lossless? What does that really mean? Does that mean metadata? Yeah, a lot of the times it means extra metadata. Sometimes it can squeeze out extra bytes, like in PNGs, for example. Sometimes transparency is encoded in weird ways, and we can just discard that information. So each ImageOptim has 9 different lossless compression tools, and if you Google it, it'll tell you what each one of those does. Yeah. More questions? Same guy. Yeah. Hi. What is the browser support for true lossless compression? You mean what is the browser doing to losslessly compress things?
Lossless JPEG or any of those others.
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. There's a ton of other image people in the audience that may be able to answer.
There's no inherent support or lack of support in browsers for lossless compression. You can losslessly compress an image that's a lossless format, like a PNG, for instance, using Cornell Kaminsky's PNG font. PNG font 2, a little bit better dithering algorithm for
Yep.
So it's not a real simple answer, but basically there's plenty of support options in the browser.
The JPEG lossless is completely different, right?
Yeah,
So
WebP and JPEG 2000.
yeah.
JPEG 2000 support is only currently available for Safari browsers, or WebKit, for instance.
Thank you. I'll give you a donut after. More questions?
How do you serve your fonts? Do you line them?
We've got a fancy pants font loader, but I do recommend you going to Zach Leatherman's talk later because he's going to go into real nitty-gritty detail about how to load fonts smartly. Definitely go check that out. In this room. Yeah.
So I'm sorry if I just missed it, but you mentioned SVG support for IE.
Yeah.
You had some tips for that?
Definitely. So that was using the new responsive images spec. So if you use the picture element and the type attribute, you can include an SVG, and then the fallback will just be the PNG. Yeah, because any browser that doesn't understand the responsive images spec is probably just going to fall back to whatever you have anyway. So it'll just bypass that SVG. But browsers that will understand that will load the SVG instead.
What about the consistency of the rendering? Do you find that to be useful?
The consistency of the rendering?
Do you find it to be reliable enough?
Yeah.
So the SVG supported first, so it actually looks the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we as an industry have moved away from pixel perfect designs, right? It's not going to look the same everywhere, and that just is okay at this point. Yeah, it's got to be. Hi.
Do you use any process for during the mocking up and during the design process to document progressive rendering versus just mock up?
Oh, that's interesting. Do we include progressive enhancement as part of design mockups? I haven't been as part of as many design critiques as I would like to, so I can't say for sure that we don't, but I feel like we don't. That'd be really interesting to include in project plans progressive enhancement details. That's a really good idea. Hi.
Do you have any tools for text-based visualization of CSS more compressible?
More compressible. So HTML and CSS that are more compressible. So you mean outside of gzip and minification? Or are those two words that are helpful? So in designforperformance.com, there's a whole section on optimizing your markup for performance, including things like minification, normalizing things because gzip really likes patterns, and then turning those on for your server. Yeah, designforperformance.com. So handy. Actually, before we get to you, Philip, yeah.
So you showed the screenshot of the before and after when you changed the fonts.
Yeah.
Did you also look at the performance differences for the two before and after and use that as part of the decision?
Because those were on development machines, they're not like real user experience performance differences. No, we didn't look at it. Those really, from a user experience perspective, it was more like convincing other designers that it was going to be an okay change for the user experience before we went and compared it in a real life experiment. And so when it went live, that's when we gathered data about the differences in performance. Yeah, we just like guessed that it was going to be better. I mean, we went from like 8 to 1 fonts, so we were confident. Yeah. Hi, yeah.
When you do your rollout of source set, do you have any issues with browsers behaving badly as far as like downloading the fallback and the responsive image?
Not that we're aware of. I mean, we tested it to make sure that it acted as we expected it to. I mean, obviously browsers are picking and choosing things themselves in a way that we can't control, but we didn't experience any like multiple downloading issues that I'm aware of. I think that's it, actually. Thank you. I'll hang out for a little bit. Thank you so much, everybody.